Tokyo, November 1943. The air inside the Naval General Staff building hangs heavy with cigarette smoke and silence. Commander Minoru Genda sits at a wooden table surrounded by folders marked with red seals. Before him lie intelligence reports from across the Pacific, photographs, intercepted radio transmissions, agent observations from neutral ports. His hands move slowly across columns of numbers, a mechanical pencil scratching calculations onto rice paper. The numbers don't make sense. They can't be real. He recalculates. The result remains the same. Across from him, Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya sets down his own pencil and removes his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Neither man speaks. They don't need to. The mathematics tell a story more terrifying than any battle report. In the 6 months since Midway, Japan has managed to replace 200 aircraft. In that same period, American factories have delivered more than 20,000. Genda looks up, meeting Okumiya's eyes. For the first time in his distinguished career, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack understands what defeat looks like. It looks like numbers on a page. To understand the horror in that Tokyo conference room, you must first understand what Japan believed about America before the war began. Japanese military planners had spent years studying their potential enemy across the Pacific. They knew the numbers. They understood that the United States possessed greater industrial capacity, more natural resources, a larger population. These facts appeared in every pre-war assessment, in every strategic document prepared by the Naval General Staff. But knowing numbers and understanding their implications are different things entirely. The Japanese High Command had convinced themselves of a crucial assumption that would prove catastrophically wrong. They believed Americans lacked the will to fight a long war. They believed that a nation grown soft on consumer goods and democratic ideals would fold after a series of devastating early defeats. They believed that striking hard and fast would force a negotiated peace before American industry could fully mobilize. This wasn't mere propaganda or wishful thinking. It was a calculated strategic assessment based on observed American behavior in the years leading to war. The United States had watched Europe burn and done nothing. America had allowed Japan to wage war in China for 4 years without direct intervention. Isolationist sentiment dominated American politics. To Japanese planners, these facts suggested a nation fundamentally unwilling to pay the blood price that modern war demanded. They would soon learn how wrong they were. December 7, 1941, changed everything, but not in the way Japan had anticipated. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had warned his superiors that attacking Pearl Harbor would awaken a sleeping giant. His words proved prophetic in ways that even he couldn't fully comprehend. Within weeks of the attack, American factories that had been producing automobiles, refrigerators, and washing machines began retooling for war production. Within months, production lines hummed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Within a year, American aircraft production exceeded all Axis powers combined. But in early 1942, these developments remained invisible to Japanese commanders, savoring victory after victory across the Pacific. The Philippines fell. Malaya fell. Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, each conquest reinforced Japanese confidence in their strategic calculations. American forces retreated everywhere. The carrier raids on Tokyo and other Japanese cities in April 1942 seemed like desperate pinpricks rather than serious military operations. Japanese intelligence officers tracked American aircraft carriers across the Pacific, noting their limited numbers, cataloging their aircraft complements. Japan possessed 10 fleet carriers in early 1942. America had 7, and one of those, the USS Saratoga, spent months under repair after torpedo damage. The mathematics seemed favorable. Japanese naval aviation was the finest in the world, their pilots the most experienced, their aircraft competitive with anything America fielded. Carrier warfare, still a relatively new form of combat, depended heavily on pilot skill and tactical coordination. Japan excelled at both. Then came Midway, June 4-7, 1942. In 3 days of combat, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. More critically, Japan lost over 300 aircraft and many of her most experienced pilots. The defeat shocked the Japanese High Command, but it didn't break their strategic confidence. Carriers could be replaced, aircraft could be built, pilots could be trained. The Japanese Navy had already laid down plans for new carrier construction. Shinano, the largest carrier ever built, was already under construction, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull. The Unryu-class carriers would follow. Japanese shipyards and aircraft factories operated at maximum capacity. The loss at Midway was devastating, certainly, but not necessarily fatal. Japan still controlled vast territories rich in resources. The southern resource area provided oil, rubber, metals, everything needed to sustain war production. Japanese factories in the home islands and occupied territories continued producing aircraft. The Mitsubishi A6M0 remained the best carrier fighter in the Pacific. The Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber had proven its worth at Pearl Harbor and Midway. Japanese industry wasn't idle. Throughout late 1942 and early 1943, factories delivered new aircraft to replace combat losses. But something had changed after Midway, something that Japanese intelligence officers began to notice as reports filtered in from across the Pacific. American carrier groups weren't withdrawing to lick their wounds, they were attacking, and they kept attacking. The Guadalcanal campaign raged from August 1942 through February 1943, a grinding battle of attrition that consumed aircraft and pilots at an alarming rate. What Japanese intelligence officers couldn't see clearly in 1942 became unmistakable by 1943. American aircraft production wasn't just recovering from pre-war levels. It was exploding into something the world had never witnessed before. Factories across the American heartland had transformed into instruments of industrial warfare on a scale that defied comprehension. In Long Beach, California, Douglas Aircraft operated a plant that covered 43 acres under one roof. The production line for the SBD Dauntless dive bomber stretched nearly half a mile. Workers entered at dawn and didn't see daylight until dusk. 3 shifts kept the line moving continuously. At peak production, a completed aircraft rolled off that line every 60 minutes, and Douglas Long Beach was just one factory producing one type of aircraft. In Bethpage, New York, Grumman Aircraft Engineering operated around the clock producing F-6F Hellcat fighters. In Fort Worth, Texas, Consolidated Aircraft built B-24 Liberator bombers on an assembly line that Henry Ford himself had helped design. In Seattle, Wichita, Baltimore, St. Louis, San Diego, in cities and towns across America, factories that hadn't existed 3 years earlier now employed tens of thousands of workers and produced hundreds of aircraft monthly. The American government had essentially nationalized industrial planning without nationalizing the factories themselves. $1-a-year men from private industry worked alongside military procurement officers, streamlining production, eliminating bottlenecks, sharing innovations across competing companies. The scale of mobilization went far beyond aircraft assembly. Entire supply chains had to be created or expanded. Aluminum production in the United States increased from 287,000 tons in 1939 to over 920,000 tons by 1943. New smelters appeared in Washington, Tennessee, and Arkansas, powered by massive hydroelectric projects built specifically to support war production. Rubber, now cut off from Southeast Asian sources, came from new synthetic rubber plants. By 1944, America produced more synthetic rubber than the world's entire natural rubber production in 1940. Engine production alone represented a staggering achievement. Pratt & Whitney produced over 363,000 aircraft engines during the war. Wright Aeronautical produced another 139,000. These weren't simple engines. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, powering the F-6F Hellcat, generated 2,000 horsepower and required precision manufacturing of thousands of components. Yet factories produced them by the hundreds per month, each engine meeting strict quality standards, each one capable of sustained operation in the harsh environments of naval aviation. Japanese intelligence officers tried to track this production through multiple sources. Neutral diplomats provided reports from visits to American factories, though naturally they saw only what American authorities wanted them to see. Signals intelligence intercepted communications between American facilities, though breaking American codes proved far more difficult than anticipated. Agents in neutral countries counted ships leaving American ports, photographed aircraft being loaded aboard carriers, tracked the movement of air groups across the Pacific. Every source pointed to the same conclusion: American production capacity exceeded Japanese estimates by orders of magnitude. Yet the full scope remained hidden behind operational security and the sheer geographical dispersion of American industry. Japan's intelligence apparatus, skilled at tactical intelligence gathering, struggled with strategic industrial assessment. Japanese intelligence officers were trained to count ships, identify aircraft types, track troop movements. They excelled at tactical and operational intelligence. But understanding the systemic capacity of an entire continental economy required different analytical frameworks, different sources, different ways of thinking about information. The Japanese intelligence system had another critical weakness. It operated within a military culture that discouraged bearers of bad news. Junior officers who compiled pessimistic assessments risked their careers. Information flowed upward through chains of command where each level might massage the data to appear more favorable. Accurate intelligence that contradicted prevailing strategic assumptions might be set aside or reinterpreted. This cultural tendency toward optimistic reporting meant that even when Japanese intelligence officers grasped the true scale of American production, their warnings might not reach decision-makers in unfiltered form. Meanwhile, American intelligence worked to obscure the true scale of production from enemy observers. Dummy factories were built. Real factories were camouflaged with painted canvas and fake structures to resemble residential areas from the air. Deliberately misleading information was fed through channels known to be monitored by Japanese intelligence. Some of these deception efforts worked, but ultimately, deception couldn't hide the appearance of new carriers, new aircraft, new air groups showing up across the Pacific in numbers that Japanese production simply couldn't match. By mid-1943, the strategic situation had fundamentally shifted. Japan's carrier force, once the most powerful in the world, was struggling to maintain operational strength. Pilot training programs, accelerated to replace losses, produced aviators with far fewer flight hours than their predecessors. Fuel shortages limited training time even for those pilots still in the program. Aircraft production, while continuing, couldn't keep pace with combat losses. The vaunted Zero-Hour cutting edge in 1941 now faced newer American fighters designed specifically to counter its advantages, and American production just kept accelerating. Essex-class fleet carriers entered service at a rate of nearly one per month during 1943. Each carried an air group of 90 aircraft. Independence-class light carriers added to the growing American advantage. Each new carrier meant another 3,000 to 5,000 sailors, another 90 pilots, another support infrastructure, and America seemed to produce all of it effortlessly, while Japan strained to maintain what it already had in service. The mathematics of industrial warfare were becoming impossible to ignore. Commander Minoru Genda wasn't a pessimist by nature. At 48 years old, he had spent his entire adult life in naval aviation, rising through the ranks on merit and innovative thinking. He had planned the tactical details of the Pearl Harbor attack, choreographing the approach routes and attack sequences that had devastated the American Pacific Fleet. He understood carrier warfare better than almost anyone in the Japanese Navy. His analytical mind naturally grasped the relationship between numbers and combat power. That same analytical clarity now forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sitting in the intelligence section, reviewing reports from the Solomon Islands campaign, Genda calculated attrition rates. Japanese naval aviation was losing approximately 100 aircraft per month in combat operations. Replacements from factories and training programs amounted to roughly 70 aircraft per month. Simple arithmetic revealed the trajectory. Japanese naval air strength was declining by 30 aircraft monthly. American losses in the same theater approximated 150 aircraft monthly. Yet American strength in the theater kept growing. New carriers appeared. Air groups grew larger. The quality of American pilots improved noticeably as training programs matured. Genda set down his pencil and looked out the window toward the Tokyo skyline. Somewhere beyond that horizon, in factories he couldn't see and would never visit, American workers were producing aircraft faster than his pilots could shoot them down. The war had become a mathematical problem with no Japanese solution. The statistics told a story of industrial warfare that redefined what modern conflict meant. In 1942, American factories produced 47,836 aircraft. Japanese factories produced 8,861. That ratio alone should have alarmed Tokyo, but 1942 represented only the beginning of American mobilization. In 1943, American production reached 85,198 aircraft. Japan managed 16,693, less than a fifth of American output. By 1944, the disparity became grotesque. America produced 96,118 aircraft that year. Japan produced 28,180. Even that Japanese figure was misleading. It included trainers, transports, and obsolescent aircraft types kept in production because factories couldn't retool quickly. Combat-capable aircraft suitable for carrier operations represented a fraction of the total. The numbers became even more damning when broken down by type. In 1943 alone, Grumman delivered 2,545 F-6F Hellcat fighters to the U.S. Navy. Japan's entire carrier fighter production that year, combining all models, including older Zeros, totaled approximately 3,500 aircraft. A single American company nearly matched Japan's entire carrier fighter output. Consolidated Aircraft produced 4,186 B-24 bombers in 1943. That production line alone exceeded Japan's total heavy bomber output for the entire war. North American aviation produced over 15,000 aircraft in 1943, more than Japan's entire aircraft industry combined. These rent propaganda figures. They were production statistics compiled from factory records, delivery schedules, and acceptance reports. Japanese intelligence obtained fragments of this information through various sources, and each fragment confirmed a nightmare. The United States wasn't just outproducing Japan. America was outproducing the entire Axis alliance combined while simultaneously supplying aircraft to Britain, the Soviet Union, and other allies under Lend-Lease agreements. The Japanese war plan had rested on assumptions that seemed reasonable in 1941 but proved catastrophically wrong by 1943. Japanese planners had studied American industrial capacity before the war. They knew the numbers. American steel production in 1940 exceeded 60 million tons. Japanese production reached barely 7 million tons. American automobile production topped 4 million vehicles annually. Japan produced fewer than 50,000. These disparities appeared in every pre-war assessment, yet Japanese planners had convinced themselves these numbers didn't determine the war's outcome. They believed that 6 months of victories would secure a defensive perimeter that America couldn't penetrate without unacceptable losses. They believed that a democracy would negotiate rather than pay the blood price for reconquest. They believed that American factory workers, soft from consumer prosperity, would lose motivation once the war dragged on. Every one of these beliefs proved wrong. The defensive perimeter, stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, proved impossible to defend adequately. Every island garrison required supply and air cover. Every convoy attracted American submarines. American code-breaking meant that Japanese fleet movements were often anticipated. And far from losing motivation, American factory workers embraced war production with an intensity that stunned observers. Women who had never worked outside the home joined production lines. Farmers' sons from Iowa operated drill presses in California. The elderly came out of retirement to share their skills. African Americans migrated from the segregated South to find good-paying factory jobs in the North and West. The American economy didn't just mobilize for war, it transformed completely. Willow Run, Michigan represented everything Japan had failed to anticipate about American industrial capacity. Before 1941, the site was farmland 30 miles west of Detroit. By 1943, it housed the largest aircraft factory in the world. Ford Motor Company built the facility to produce B-24 Liberator bombers using automotive assembly line techniques. The main building stretched more than half a mile long and a quarter-mile wide, covering 67 acres. At peak production, the line completed one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. Workers entered through 52 gates. Parking lots accommodated 20,000 vehicles. A dedicated rail line brought in aluminum, steel, engines, propellers, instruments, and countless other components from suppliers across the nation. Another rail line carried completed bombers to modification centers. Charles Lindbergh visited Willow Run in 1942 and called it the Grand Canyon of mechanized production. The factory employed over 40,000 workers at its peak. They came from everywhere, farm boys and city dwellers, men and women, whites and blacks, experienced machinists and complete novices. Ford's training program took people who had never seen an aircraft rivet and turned them into skilled aviation workers in weeks. The assembly line broke bomber construction into thousands of small tasks. Each worker mastered a specific operation. This specialization meant that the loss of any individual worker didn't disrupt production. New workers could be trained quickly. Quality control inspectors checked work at every stage. The process was designed for speed and reliability, and it worked. Similar transformations occurred across America. Douglas Aircraft in Oklahoma City, Boeing in Wichita, Bell Aircraft in Buffalo, consolidated in Fort Worth. Each factory represented billions of dollars in investment, tens of thousands of jobs, and production capacity that dwarfed anything Japan could create. Japanese aircraft designers had focused on range and maneuverability, creating aircraft that excelled in the war's early battles. The Zero could outmaneuver any American fighter in 1941. Its range allowed it to escort bombers on missions that American fighters couldn't match. But these advantages came at a cost. The Zero lacked armor protection for the pilot. It lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. A few rounds from a heavy machine gun could set it ablaze. Japanese designers had accepted these trade-offs deliberately, prioritizing performance over survivability. This philosophy reflected Japanese military culture, which emphasized warrior spirit and skill over mechanical protection. American designers took a different approach. The F-6F Hellcat that entered service in 1943 couldn't outmaneuver a Zero in a dogfight, but it didn't need to. The Hellcat was faster, could dive faster, and could absorb tremendous battle damage and keep flying. Its 6 heavy machine guns delivered devastating firepower. Most importantly, American pilots received tactical training that negated the Zero's maneuverability advantages. Don't dogfight, use speed and altitude. Dive, shoot, climb away. The Hellcat's performance envelope perfectly matched these tactics. American aircraft also incorporated lessons learned in combat far faster than Japanese designs. Modified gun sights appeared on American carriers within months of pilots reporting problems. Radio communications improved continuously. Radar systems were miniaturized and installed in night fighters. American aircraft arriving in the Pacific in 1944 incorporated technological improvements that Japanese designers knew about but couldn't implement. Japan lacked the industrial capacity to produce sufficient numbers of new designs while maintaining production of existing types. American factories could introduce improved models without reducing OEE's raw production numbers. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya had served as an air staff officer throughout the Pacific War. He had reviewed casualty reports, tracked pilot experience levels, monitored training programs, and compiled intelligence on American capabilities. By late 1943, the psychological weight of this information had become almost unbearable. He knew things that most Japanese officers didn't know or refused to believe. He knew that Japanese pilot training programs had been cut from 2 years to 6 months due to fuel shortages and attrition. He knew that new pilots arrived at frontline units with barely 100 flight hours compared to the 300 hours their predecessors had accumulated. He knew that American pilot training programs were expanding and producing aviators with increasingly sophisticated training. He knew all of this, and he knew what it meant. Japan was losing the war of attrition, not losing in a temporary sense that could be reversed with better tactics or improved technology, losing in a fundamental structural sense that no amount of courage or skill could overcome. The knowledge created a peculiar psychological burden. Okumiya couldn't share his assessments openly without risking accusations of defeatism. Yet concealing the truth from decision-makers who needed accurate information seemed equally wrong. He wrote carefully worded reports that presented the facts without drawing explicit conclusions. He hoped that intelligent readers would understand the implications. Some did, most didn't want to. The gap between what Japanese intelligence officers knew and what Japanese military leadership was willing to believe grew wider as 1943 became 1944. This gap would have profound consequences for the battles to come. June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea, west of the Mariana Islands. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the Japanese mobile fleet, built around 9 carriers and 473 aircraft. Ozawa knew his force was outnumbered. American Task Force 58 under Admiral Mark Mitcher deployed 15 carriers with more than 900 aircraft. But Ozawa had planned carefully. Japanese aircraft had longer range than their American counterparts. This range advantage would allow Japanese planes to strike American carriers while remaining beyond the range of American counterstrikes. Japanese land-based aircraft from Guam and other Mariana airfields would support the carrier attack. The plan was sound, the tactics reasonable. It failed completely. The battle that followed would be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots, a nickname that captured both the one-sided nature of the combat and the dark humor of men who had just participated in an aerial slaughter. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft flew into American defensive screens. American radar picked them up at great distance. Fighter direction officers vectored Hellcats toward the incoming strikes. What followed was less a battle than an execution. American pilots, many on their first combat mission, shot down Japanese aircraft with casual efficiency. Experienced Japanese pilots who had survived earlier battles fell alongside the inexperienced replacements. The turkey shoot nickname wasn't quite accurate. Turkeys don't shoot back. Japanese pilots fought desperately, but they were overmatched in every category. American aircraft were faster, more heavily armed, more survivable. American pilots were better trained and better equipped. American radar meant that Japanese strikes were intercepted before reaching their targets. At the end of the first day, Japanese naval aviation had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Ozawa lost 3 carriers and more than 350 aircraft. American losses totaled 29 aircraft in combat, with another 20 lost to operational accidents. The kill ratio approached 15-1. But the numbers alone didn't capture what had happened. Japan had committed her carefully hoarded carrier air groups, the replacement pilots trained at great expense. The reserve of strength held back for the decisive battle that Japanese doctrine demanded. They had been destroyed in an afternoon. Aboard his flagship, Ozawa received damage reports throughout the day. Each report brought worse news. The carrier Taiho, newest and largest in the fleet, sunk by a submarine torpedo that ignited aviation fuel vapors. The carrier Shikaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea, also torpedoed and sunk. The carrier Hio, torpedoed by American aircraft and sunk the following day. Aircraft losses mounted into hundreds. Pilot losses couldn't be accurately calculated until survivors were recovered, but preliminary estimates suggested that more than half of all aircrew launched that day were dead or missing. The Americans had lost a carrier battle without losing a carrier. They had achieved air superiority so complete that Japanese survivors reported feeling helpless, unable to even reach their targets through the defending fighters. In Tokyo, initial reports of the battle were fragmentary and confused. The Naval General Staff received optimistic claims from pilots who had survived, reports of hits on American carriers, of successful strikes, of valiant combat. These reports flowed through the system, filtered and massaged at each level, until the version presented to senior commanders bore little resemblance to reality. Commander Genda received the raw intelligence data. He saw the discrepancies between pilot claims and reconnaissance reports. He noted that American carrier groups continued operating at full strength despite Japanese claims of multiple carriers sunk or damaged. He compiled the actual aircraft loss figures from squadron reports. The numbers were catastrophic. In a single day, Japan had lost more carrier aircraft than her factories could replace in 3 months. More critically, she had lost pilots who couldn't be replaced at all. Training a competent carrier pilot required at least a year, even under peacetime conditions. Japan no longer had a year, no longer had the fuel for extended training, no longer had the luxury of time. Genda sat in his office reading report after report, each one confirming the disaster. He thought about the briefings he had attended before the operation, the optimistic assessments, the confident predictions. He thought about the young pilots he had known, eager men who had believed their training and their aircraft would be sufficient. He thought about the American carriers, which would steam back to Pearl Harbor, repair minor damage, replenish their aircraft from the seemingly endless supply flowing from American factories, and return to combat within weeks. The disparity had been theoretical before the Philippine Sea. Numbers on paper, intelligence estimates, projections and calculations. Now it was concrete. Now it was bodies in the water and empty flight decks. Now it was the smoking wreckage of 3 carriers slipping beneath the waves. Now it was undeniable. The intelligence reports compiled after the Philippine Sea battle forced Japanese naval officers to confront facts they had been avoiding. The raw numbers admitted no optimistic interpretation. American factories had replaced their midway losses within 4 months. Japanese yards were still working to replace carriers lost 2 years earlier. American pilot training programs produced thousands of qualified aviators quarterly. Japanese training programs had collapsed under fuel shortages and attrition among instructors. American carriers operated with air groups of 90 aircraft each. Japanese carriers, when they could operate at all, often sailed with partial air groups due to aircraft shortages. The strategic implications cascaded through every level of analysis. Japan could not win a war of attrition. Japan could not achieve the decisive battle that naval doctrine demanded because American numerical superiority made such a battle suicidal. Japan could not defend her conquered territories because doing so required air superiority that could no longer be maintained. Japan could not even effectively retreat to a tighter defensive perimeter because American submarines and aircraft could interdict supply lines faster than Japan could establish them. Lieutenant Commander Okumiya prepared a comprehensive assessment for the Naval General Staff. He documented American production capacity using intelligence from multiple sources. He calculated replacement rates, training throughput, and force deployment timelines. He projected future scenarios based on current trends. Every scenario ended in Japanese defeat. The only variables were timing and the scale of destruction required to force surrender. Okumiya's report circulated through the Naval General Staff in August 1944. Some officers read it carefully, understanding its implications. Others dismissed it as defeatist. Still others accepted the facts but argued that fighting on remained Japan's only honorable course. The cultural context mattered enormously. Japanese military tradition emphasized will over materiel, spirit over statistics. Admitting that the war was mathematically unwinnable contradicted decades of indoctrination. The Meiji generation had defeated Russia in 1905 despite being outmatched industrially. The early Pacific War victories had been achieved against numerically superior forces. Surely spirit and skill could overcome American material advantages. But this time was different, and some officers recognized that difference. The disparity wasn't marginal, it was overwhelming. America wasn't just producing more aircraft. America was producing 50 times more aircraft. America wasn't just training more pilots. America was training them to higher standards with better equipment. America wasn't just fighting in the Pacific. America was simultaneously fighting in Europe, supplying allies worldwide, and still increasing production. The scale of American mobilization exceeded anything in human history. One intelligence assessment noted that American aircraft production in 1944 would exceed the total production of all nations combined in 1939. Another assessment calculated that American industrial output equaled that of the rest of the world combined. These weren't exaggerations, they were conservative estimates based on verified data, and the implications were inescapable. In September 1944, a small group of senior naval officers met informally to discuss the war situation. No official minutes were kept. The meeting itself was technically improper, bordering on insubordination, because it questioned strategic decisions made by the high command. But the men involved were senior enough and respected enough that their meeting wouldn't be reported. They discussed Okamiya's report. They reviewed intelligence from other sources. They debated options. Withdrawal from the Philippines would shorten supply lines but abandon resources Japan desperately needed. Defending the Philippines would require committing remaining carrier forces to battle against overwhelming odds. Some form of negotiated peace seemed the only rational course, but no one present believed the Americans would negotiate. The Casablanca Conference's demand for unconditional surrender had eliminated that possibility. The meeting ended without conclusions or decisions. The officers returned to their duties. But something had changed. Men who had believed victory was possible now understood they were fighting only to delay defeat. Men who had trusted in Japanese superiority now grasped that they had been overwhelmed by an industrial machine beyond their comprehension. The psychological impact was profound and demoralizing. Japanese military culture demanded fighting spirit, but fighting spirit couldn't overcome simple mathematics. A skilled pilot in an inferior aircraft would be shot down by a mediocre pilot in a superior aircraft. Courage couldn't dodge radar-guided interceptions. Willpower couldn't summon replacement aircraft from empty hangars. The truth that Japanese intelligence officers had discovered was simple and brutal. America could afford to trade losses at 1-to-1 ratios and still win. Japan needed to achieve kill ratios of 10-to-1 or better just to maintain parity. And the Philippine Sea had demonstrated that such ratios were impossible to achieve against American numerical superiority and improving technology. October 1944 brought the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, and Japan's last serious attempt to challenge American naval dominance. Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded the main Japanese surface force centered on the super battleships Yamato and Musashi. The plan was complex, involving multiple forces converging on American amphibious operations in the Philippines. The plan required carrier aircraft to draw away American covering forces, but Japan no longer had effective carrier aviation. The 4 carriers assigned to the operation carried only 116 aircraft total, barely more than a single American carrier would deploy. These aircraft weren't even intended for offensive operations. They were bait, meant to lure American carriers away from the landing beaches while Japanese surface forces attacked the vulnerable transports and amphibious ships. The plan failed. American submarines detected Japanese forces early. American aircraft from land bases and carriers struck repeatedly. The Musashi, supposedly unsinkable, absorbed 19 torpedo and 17 bomb hits before capsizing. Kurita's force was mauled but pressed on toward the landing beaches. In the confusion of battle, Kurita hesitated, then withdrew, abandoning the attack when he was actually within range of his targets. The Japanese Navy lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers at Leyte Gulf. American losses totaled 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. But the numbers didn't tell the full story. Japan had committed nearly every operational ship she still possessed. The losses at Leyte Gulf effectively eliminated the Japanese Navy as a fighting force. More significantly, Leyte Gulf marked the appearance of a new Japanese tactic born from desperation. On October 25th, organized kamikaze attacks began. Pilots deliberately crashed their aircraft into American ships, using the plane itself as a weapon. The tactic emerged from the collision of Japanese cultural values with material reality. Japan could no longer train pilots to the skill level required for conventional combat. Japan could no longer produce sufficient aircraft for sustained operations. But Japan could train pilots to take off, locate a target, and crash into it. Basic flying skills sufficed for suicide attacks. Obsolete aircraft unsuitable for combat could be used as flying bombs. The kamikaze tactic was simultaneously logical and insane, a rational response to impossible circumstances that required young men to embrace certain death. American intelligence officers studied the phenomenon with a mixture of horror and bewilderment. The tactic worked to an extent. Kamikaze attacks sank dozens of ships and damaged hundreds more. But even this desperate innovation couldn't overcome American material advantages. American factories simply built more ships. American shipyards repaired damaged vessels with astonishing speed. American damage control techniques, learned painfully in earlier battles, minimized casualties and saved ships that would have been lost. And American defenses adapted. More fighter patrols, radar picket ships, improved anti-aircraft weapons, proximity-fused shells, each innovation reduced kamikaze effectiveness. By early 1945, American forces were destroying the majority of kamikaze attackers before they reached their targets. The tactic imposed costs on American forces, but it couldn't change the war's trajectory. In Tokyo, the Naval General Staff struggled to maintain operational planning in the face of impossible realities. Commander Genda and his colleagues compiled reports that grew increasingly pessimistic. By January 1945, Japanese carrier aviation had essentially ceased to exist. The few remaining carriers sat in ports, unable to operate for lack of fuel, aircraft, and trained pilots. Japanese land-based air forces continued fighting, but they were being ground down in battles they couldn't win. American air raids on Japanese cities intensified. B-29 superfortresses flew from bases in the Marianas, bases that Japan lacked the air power to attack. The strategic situation had become hopeless, but the war continued. The intelligence officers who had calculated American production capacity years earlier now watched their predictions come true with terrible precision. Every estimate they had made about American replacement rates proved conservative. American factories had exceeded even pessimistic Japanese projections. In 1945 alone, American factories would produce nearly 50,000 aircraft. Japanese production would fall to barely 11,000 aircraft, and most of those would never reach operational units. Fuel shortages, pilot shortages, spare parts shortages, and American air raids combined to strand aircraft in depots and on factory airfields. The numbers that had frightened Japanese intelligence officers in 1943 now seemed almost quaint. The disparity had grown even wider. American production had continued accelerating even as Japanese production declined. The industrial war had been decided years earlier, but the shooting continued. Lieutenant Commander Okumiya survived the war and later wrote extensively about Japanese naval aviation's collapse. His post-war writings revealed the psychological burden of knowing the war was lost while being unable to stop it. He described what young pilots received their orders, knowing they would likely die in their first combat mission, knowing their sacrifice would accomplish nothing strategic, knowing that American factories would replace any losses they inflicted within days. He described the moral weight of sending men to meaningless deaths because surrender was culturally impossible, and because the American demand for unconditional surrender left no room for negotiation. Years after the war, Okumiya met with former American officers. They discussed the battles they had fought from opposite sides. The Americans described their own fears and uncertainties, the periods when they thought the war might last years longer, the relief when it finally ended. Okumiya shared Japanese intelligence assessments showing that Japanese officers had known the war was lost long before surrender. The Americans were shocked. They had believed they were fighting an enemy who thought victory was still possible. Learning that Japanese officers had recognized defeat but continued fighting anyway created a strange mutual understanding. Both sides had been trapped in a war that industrial mathematics had already decided. The Japanese intelligence officers who had calculated American production rates became tragic figures. Men who saw the truth clearly but couldn't change the outcome. Prophets without honor in a culture that valued willpower over facts. The final accounting of aircraft production told the story completely. From 1941 through 1945, the United States produced approximately 300,000 military aircraft. Japan produced approximately 76,000. That 4-to-1 disparity didn't account for quality differences, technological improvements, or the fact that American aircraft were typically larger, more capable, and more survivable than their Japanese counterparts. It didn't account for the pilot training disparity, the fuel shortages that hobbled Japanese operations, or the American submarines that sank Japanese tankers and cargo ships carrying aviation fuel and raw materials. The industrial war had been a massacre, rendered in statistics and production figures rather than blood and fire. But it had been a massacre nonetheless. The Japanese intelligence officers who recognized this reality in 1943 had watched helplessly as their predictions came true. They had compiled the reports, done the calculations, presented the facts, and they had been ignored, dismissed, or simply disbelieved by commanders who couldn't accept that warrior spirit was insufficient against an enemy who produced aircraft faster than they could be destroyed. The tragedy wasn't that Japan lost the industrial war. That outcome was inevitable once American factories mobilized. The tragedy was that so many people died after the outcome was already determined, after the mathematics had rendered further fighting pointless, after intelligence officers had calculated exactly how the war would end. The story of Japanese intelligence officers calculating American aircraft production capacity is ultimately a story about the nature of modern warfare. The 20th century transformed war from a contest of armies and courage into a contest of industries and systems. The side that could produce more ships, more aircraft, more tanks, more ammunition would eventually prevail regardless of tactical skill or fighting spirit. This transformation had been underway since the Industrial Revolution, but World War II marked the point where industrial capacity became utterly dominant. The Japanese officers who recognized this reality faced a terrible knowledge. They understood that their comrades were dying in a war already lost, that their sacrifices achieved nothing except delay, that every battle was simply consuming lives that could never be replaced while the enemy's losses were made good within weeks. They understood, and they could do nothing. The cultural and political systems within which they operated couldn't accommodate the truth they had discovered. In retrospect, the outcome seems obvious. Of course, America's vastly larger industrial base would prevail. Of course, a nation with 10 times the steel production and infinite oil supplies would eventually overwhelm an island nation dependent on imported resources. But hindsight simplifies what was genuinely uncertain at the time. In early 1942, after Pearl Harbor and the fall of Singapore, Japanese victory seemed entirely possible. The transformation from possible victory to certain defeat took place over 18 months, tracked by intelligence officers who watched the numbers shift inexorably against them. The lesson extends beyond World War II. Modern warfare remains fundamentally an industrial and systemic competition. Technology, production capacity, supply chains, training systems, and resource access determine outcomes more surely than battlefield heroics. A military force that cannot replace its losses, cannot sustain operations, cannot adapt to enemy innovations will eventually be defeated regardless of tactical skill. The Japanese intelligence officers who went pale while calculating American aircraft production rates had discovered this truth before most of their contemporaries. They had stared into the face of industrial warfare and recognized that their nation had entered a contest it could not win. Their calculations were accurate, their analysis was sound, their predictions came true. And none of it mattered, because the war machine, once set in motion, could not be stopped by mere truth. The memory of those intelligence officers sitting in dim Tokyo offices surrounded by reports and statistics, calculating the impossible mathematics of their nation's defeat, should stand as a reminder of war's fundamental irrationality. They knew. They understood. They could prove mathematically that continuing the war served no purpose. And the war continued anyway, consuming hundreds of thousands more lives, until industrial reality imposed the surrender that rational analysis had predicted years earlier. This is the true horror of modern war, not that men die, but that they die even after the outcome is already decided, ground into oblivion by forces too vast and too impersonal to be stopped by anything as small as truth.